Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for coming on my show. I'm really excited. What an
Oh,
honor.
and wine.
Nice. It's too early for me to drink, so I'm just on water right now.
Oh, what a shame. Never
I
mind.
know. I
I'll do it for
usually
both of us.
it's almost 1:30 p.m., so I
Oh, you
feel
can drink at 1:30 p.m.
I
You
could.
can drink. Yeah, you can drink after 11 a.m. That's the rule.
Oh, okay, that's the rule. I didn't realize that was the rule. If
The
only
rule.
I had known. I've
It's fine.
wasted all of these years waiting until, post like 4 p.m. to drink. um, I mean, I feel like usually I do like to drink through these things, just because I
Yeah.
can, and I mean any opportunity is a good opportunity, but
Oh, yeah.
I also feel like it's gonna make me sleepy and I won't be able to get any work
Yeah.
done then. And I'm
Okay.
trying to stay productive during Corona.
Fair enough. Sounds good. Very sensible, actually. Very sensible.
I feel a
It's
bit
all
like
right for
it.
me because it's 9:30 here, so I'm just drinking and then going to bed.
Perfect.
That's fine.
Okay, well you can drink for the both of us.
I'll do that.
Okay, so first of all, like, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm really busy actually. I mean, I'm just in lockdown, so I'm not really seeing anyone very much. But I'm super busy. I'm working like all day, which actually is good. I think if I didn't have much work to do, I'd go nuts because it would just become so boring and oppressive. So I'm glad that I'm busy. And it's fine. I'm going for long bike rides, working, working, working. The thing that worries me now is that they're saying the lockdown could last 3 months or 6 months, which I think would be unbearable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of in a similar position to you. So I'm super busy, and I actually, for the first couple of weeks, I was like pretty stoked. I was like, this is great. Like, I have so much time to focus on
Yeah,
my writing and to do all these things that, like, I didn't do or didn't have time to do and focus on because, like, you're in the same position where I'm sure I mean, you're still doing media interviews. I'm not doing any media stuff right now, and then traveling and
yeah.
talks and all that. So it takes
I
away
was
from.
supposed to go to New York next week for to do like 8 podcasts and a couple of TV things, and it's all completely fallen apart.
Yeah,
But it'll come back eventually.
yeah. I mean, what are your kind of Corona predictions? Like, when do you think? I know that's like a massive question, but I guess, I mean, when do you think things might be able to? People always get mad when people say get back to normal, but like,
Yeah.
and or they're like, we don't want normal. Normal is bad, and I'm like, I want normal.
I I've never wanted normality more
I like
in my.
normal.
No, I've had the same thing. People saying, "What do you mean normal? Don't we need to go back to a better form of socialism?" You think that not now. Let's just focus on getting life back on to normality. Um, I don't know when. My thoughts on it change all the time. This curve everyone's obsessed with, it's starting to flatten in Europe, which is good. It's starting to flatten even in Italy and Spain. And I think it's starting to flatten in the UK. And apparently that's the turning point. But the thing is that no one wants to talk about this. But when you ease the lockdown, the virus is going to come back. I mean, that's what happened in China. It's completely and utterly inevitable. Once a virus is out, it stays out. So people aren't facing up to the reality that this virus is going to be around and we have to learn to live with it. We can't stay in lockdown for a year because the whole economy would collapse.
No, we can't. I mean, my sort of thoughts were, this is just based on what I've read, and basically I've stopped reading anything but like Corona related stuff. So I don't want to like pretend that I've come up with this on my own or that I'm some kind of expert. But it seems to me like we might be able to come out of lockdown early June, and then we'll get another wave of infections
Yeah,
in the fall, and then have to go into lockdown again, and then hopefully
yeah,
there'll be some kind of vaccine, so we'll be able to start kind of dealing with it.
yeah. I think I've seen things. I've read reports like that too. I even think lockdown till June is going to be really difficult. It's going to start getting. I mean, if you think about you know, mums with 3 or 4 children in small flats, and teenagers, and old people who've got 6 months left to live. You know, they don't want to spend those 6 months cooped up. So I think a lot of those tensions are going to start coming to the surface. And in Italy, people are now starting to protest, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
been in lockdown for, yeah. They're looting I mean, people in Italy are actually going hungry. It's really a desperate situation, and they've had lockdown for about 3.5 weeks, I think. In China, there have been riots when they were locked down for 3 months. They've now been rioting in the streets. So social unrest is not impossible if it goes on too long. I think I think our government is probably quite aware of that, but it's now in a state of complete mayhem because Boris is incredibly ill.
So yeah, I mean it's a tough balance, obviously, and I know that I've read, I think all, if not most of, at least most of what you've written about this. I mean, it's obviously a tough balance because I agree with the lockdowns because to me it seems like the only way to get a handle on this and to avoid overloading the healthcare system.
Yeah,
But of course, I mean, I also feel like we can't do this forever. Partly
yeah,
because it's horrible, you know, like I said, I'm in a pretty good position. I'm used to working at home. Like I'm used to being home by myself and I have my routine here anyway, but the lack of social contact and human contact, you know, I socialize a lot considering that I mostly work in my house and like I like being around people and that's been really hard on me because
yeah,
you know, I live alone with my dog and which is great, but like, you know,
yeah.
that it gives me anxiety. Like I've never experienced something like this and I'm like, "Oh, this is stressful." Like and the idea that it might go on for months where I just can't be with other people, you know, that's hard.
No,
But
I think a lot of people, that's knocking a lot of people for six, that realization. And so there's the lack of social contact. There's also, I think there's a real class dynamic to this. So there are so many, well-off journalists in the UK who are just saying work from home, stop going to parks and so on. These are people who live in big houses with big gardens who can still carry on working. They do their little reports from home, they do their podcasts, they do everything, they can do everything. But, there are millions of people who can no longer work, which is quite demeaning. They live in small apartments or houses. They don't have any sun or garden. So for them, the lockdown is a real big burden. I think there's this kind of simmering class tension going on because there are so many well-off people in the UK. They're really starting to get on my nerves, particularly these kind of middle-class millennial, pseudo-socialists who are constantly online saying lockdown, 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 with no consideration whatsoever for people who are plumbers or I don't know, bus drivers or construction workers. It's that side of it I find really repugnant, at least because I agree with you. The lockdown probably needs to happen at least to ease the burden on the health service. Once that's been achieved, we can maybe ease a little bit. But there at least needs to be a discussion about the massive consequences of the lockdown for working people. And that's just being pushed aside.
yeah, I mean, to me, I don't know what the solution is. I mean, here, you know, bus drivers still are working, although I'm sure many of them have been laid off, because people are not commuting and taking the bus as much, and less people are allowed on the buses, and so on and so forth. Um, I mean, I felt a lot of anger throughout all of this, partly towards people who, yeah, I guess are middle class. But I mean, my personal anger, we don't actually need to get into this too much. I'm just like, well, I'm annoyed because it's like, I've been frustrated because, like, well, I just feel like the conversation around isolation has focused on a certain kind of person and
Yeah,
particularly on families. So I feel like it's lacking acknowledgement in terms of people who are actually really alone. And then, like you said,
yeah,
like older people who are alone, people who are alone and lost their jobs and they're just alone in their apartment and they don't have money and they don't really have anything to do. And like, as
might not have internet. Older people who don't use the internet, they're not connected in the way that people like us are. You know, there are some people. I mean, I think there are gradients of loneliness. I think it's hitting everyone. The isolation is hitting everyone in different ways. But the people I think of as, you know, in my local pub, in the daytime, you would always see these old men in there on their own, sat down with a newspaper and a pint, probably widowers, probably one of their few connections with the world. Where are they now? They're just at home, completely on their own, no internet connection. They don't have WhatsApp and TikTok or anything like that. That's desperately sad. And I think there will be health consequences from that as well. Mm-hmm. So it's the thing I'm worried about is, you know, there are serious health consequences from the virus, and obviously society's got to tackle that. But I think there are also health consequences from the lockdown, and in terms of mental health, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health. All of that is going to be impacted on the longer it goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like a lot of the conversation has centered around families, which is the thing that I really just wanted to talk shit about families now.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, well, because it's like there's no concept of isolation for people who are in families. And I know that families are facing their own challenges, and I'm sure that it's hard on relationships to be, you know, trapped together all the time. But at the same time, it's like, you're not actually isolated. Like, you're with four people and you're doing things and you're engaged and
you're hanging out with people and no,
they're out at the park all the time, and like the rest of us are like, stay home, stay inside your house. But not you guys just keep on doing your thing.
No, that's right. I think, you know, many families are quite lucky. At least they are still together. And if you're a well-off family in a big house, I'm sure it's actually quite bearable. Totally. But, you know, then there are other, you know, of course, there are women who live in families they'd rather not live in, and that's becoming a real problem here in the UK. And, you know, in immigrant families here, there's often intergenerational families in households, you know, children, mothers, grandmothers, which creates all sorts of tension. So I think most families are actually in a better position than people who live on their own. But then I think there are some families where, you know, where it's such an unbearable situation, they're probably thinking to themselves, I can't stay with these people for 3 months. Yeah. So it's probably driving some people a bit mad. But yeah, the focus is too much on families. I agree. We've got to look at, you know, social isolation was a problem anyway in our societies, even before it was a physical demand by the government. Now that it's enforced, I think it's going to get a lot worse. Yeah.
So I wonder what you think about how governments took action. I mean, Canada went into lockdown probably around the same time as the US and the UK. The UK maybe dragged their heels a little bit more than Canada, but I don't think in a super notable way. And of course, you know, like, who knew about this virus on December 31st?
Yeah.
And nobody did anything about it. Like, governments didn't do anything. They basically ignored it until they had no choice. And at that point, it was in some ways too late. What do you think about, you know, how the government in the UK took action?
I think it was definitely slack. I think it was slow on some fronts. I think it was we live under quite a sclerotic state. It's a very slothful, bureaucratic machine, and it's often not very responsive to problems. And I think that's really been shown by this crisis. The real problem is the lack of preparedness for, you know, protective equipment for NHS workers, the lack of testing. I mean, we're now being told that it won't be until the end of April that we can actually test people to see if they've had the disease, which is terrible because antibody testing is really the way forward for tackling the disease and easing the lockdown. So another month before we even have those tests, never mind rolling them out to millions of people. So there's a real, they haven't handled it very well at all. But at the same time, I have a very unpopular opinion, which is that I think, one among many, I think that I don't think herd immunity is a horrible phrase. It sounds like we're cattle. I think a preferable phrase is community resilience. I don't think community resilience is necessarily a bad idea. I think that's probably what we'll have to do in the long run anyway, and that's what Sweden is trying to do. So Sweden still remains pretty open. So we'll have a counterfactual in Sweden, one way or the other. The Netherlands is still pretty open. They've got a few rules and regulations, but that you can still go out, you can still go to work, you can still go to pubs. So those two countries are trying a different approach, and the experts in those countries are saying, guys, you can't lock away a virus. That's not how it works. So you've got to let it take its course in as least a destructive way as possible. So that's what our government wanted to do, but they got badgered so badly, particularly by the media, who said this is the most irresponsible thing that's ever happened, that they completely changed course. So one of the reasons they were very late in what they're now doing is because they had a different plan originally and then they abandoned it. I'm not sure abandoning it completely was the right thing to do. That's my concern.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, Sweden is in a different situation than many other countries because they're small. Like, they're smaller than the UK, obviously. There's way less people in Sweden. So there's not, I guess, I sort of think there's less chance of there being super crowded areas where you're around tons of people and you can't get away from them. And because in Sweden they have sort of a level of respect for their government and they trust their government in a way that doesn't exist in many other countries. And so if the government says, hey, try to keep your distance, then people, I think, will respect that more so. Yeah.
I think that's right. It's very different. And lots of Swedish people already work from home, or it's an acceptable thing to do. So a lot of them are doing it. And high levels of public trust in institutions, trust in government, and vice versa, government trust in citizens. So Sweden lends itself better to that approach. Whereas Britain is it's a huge country in terms of population. It's very patchy. Some people trust the government, many people don't. So probably it would have been a more bumpy ride. But I think I understand the impulse behind it. The real reason we couldn't do it is because there would have come a point when the National Health Service couldn't have coped with the number of sick people. So there did have to be a lockdown. I fully accept that. The thing that concerns me now is the question of how long it will go on, what its impact will be on health and economy and suicide and alcoholism and all these other things and all these unintended consequences. So, for example, there is anecdotal evidence already that lots of people are not going to doctors or the hospital if they feel ill because they don't want to be a burden. I mean, all of that will have an impact on life expectancy and general health. So I think at the end of this, which could be in a year, 2 year, 3 years time, by the time we have all the statistics, we will need to have a proper reckoning with the impact of the virus and the impact of the lockdown. And then I think we'll know what was worse.
Right. I mean, we won't even know what happens in Sweden until they kind of go on with this plan for a little while. Maybe it will work for them. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll make things worse. I mean, so I wonder, I guess, what you think a better solution would be, because I know that your opinion has been controversial online because you've spoken out against the lockdowns, and you've expressed concerns about, implementing a police state. I'm not sure if those are your words or the words of other people who are sort of expressing similar concerns. But, losing our civil liberties, I guess.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about that. We have this new bill, this new act of law in the UK, which was passed a week or so ago, called the Coronavirus Bill, which is the most draconian piece of legislation in the history of this country in peacetime. I mean, it is extraordinary. Completely bans public gatherings with no exception for political gatherings or trade union gatherings. So we cannot protest against the government right now. You would be instantly criminalized and arrested. It even makes it easier to section people under the Mental Health Act. It usually takes 2 doctors before you can force a mentally unwell person to go into care. Now it only takes 1 doctor. It restricts what you can publish online. It has restrictions on so-called fake news and so on. So it is incredibly authoritarian piece of legislation. So I'm really worried about that. Now, I'm not saying rip it up, cancel the lockdown, let's all go outside and spread the disease. I do think rules and regulations are necessary for a period of time. I do think social distancing is necessary. I'm observing the lockdown meticulously. But I think we absolutely should feel profoundly uncomfortable with it. And we shouldn't take to it naturally. And that's the thing I'm bristling against most. I'm bristling against the idea that it's fine to do this, that it's fine that every single one of our fundamental freedoms has disappeared overnight. And Parliament in this country has effectively been suspended. They've retired. So there's no parliament. We don't have political representation anymore, and we have this new act of law which deprives us of the most basic freedom of all, which is the freedom to protest against government. So maybe that's all necessary. I'm kind of convinced that some of it is for the time being, but I want people to feel more uncomfortable about it. I want people to talk about it. I want people to say, okay, let's do the lockdown, but this is dreadful and not what this country is about, and we've got to cancel it as soon as possible and rip up the coronavirus bill and get all our freedoms back. I'm not seeing that side of the discussion. So the thing that concerns me most about what's happening in the UK right now in particular is the naturalness and the ease with which many people have adapted to this completely illiberal society. And that's making me wonder if freedom is as valued here as I would like it to be.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like I said, like I've been one of those people who's definitely supported the lockdowns, and really only because to me it seems like the only way to deal with this at this point. And, I don't want people getting arrested or fined because they're not observing the directions, the rules, the 2-meter apart rule. But, unfortunately, the reality in Vancouver it seems fine now, that people weren't paying attention. People were ignoring those directions. They were still going out and doing the same things they were always doing, like gathering in the park, going to the beach, hanging out, having people over to their apartments. And I want to do all that stuff too. Like part of me was mad because I was observing it pretty rigorously also, and I was like, well, I want to hang out too. But I don't know what the alternative is. And I guess, your perspective is fair. Like, we should be paying attention to this stuff and we should be concerned. But I'm not sure that there's any alternative at this point. If people are going to follow these rules voluntarily, which I think most of us are in Vancouver at this point, but probably that's partly because the government has said, okay, now we can fine people and we could arrest people. They're not doing it. Like, the only people who've been fined are people, like there was like a couple guys, I think there's maybe even 4 total. And it was because they were infected and not observing the quarantine rules, or because they'd returned from travel and weren't observing the quarantine rules. It wasn't like 2 people out walking around 2 meters apart and one of them got too close and somebody got like arrested or fined or something. So that's my issue. Yeah.
I think, most people here, the vast majority of people here are observing the guidelines and the social distancing rules and the lockdown. People are, this country has come to a standstill. Train travel is down by about 90%. Tube travel is down by around 90%. When I go outside, there's just no one around. It's just a complete ghost town. So people are staying indoors. They're going out for their daily exercise. They're shopping every now and then, but not that often, in fact. Alcohol sales have risen by 20%, which is my favorite statistic so far, because people are indoors and drinking. So all the signs suggest that people are doing it properly. Now, of course, there are handfuls of people. I've seen gangs of teenagers on their bikes with each other, and they cycle up close to you because they think that's funny. I've seen that a couple of times. But, teenagers have always been like that. And so I can kind of handle that to a certain extent. But I think my issue is that I think if it becomes overly draconian, it will actually undermine the popular compliance. Because at the moment, the compliance in the UK is pretty popular. People support it. They think it's a necessary action, and they're willing to sacrifice their freedoms for a period of time. if the government pushes harder and harder, so for example, the government is now considering banning outdoor exercise entirely, so you couldn't go outside for exercise, which would be devastating to people who live in flats, small houses and everything else, and it would really hit poor people in particular. You know, parks in London, some of our great parks were built precisely by the Victorians precisely to give space to poor people who didn't have gardens, and that's the point of many of these huge grand parks we have. And now suddenly, for the first time in history, really, those parks would be closed off to the people who need them most. I think that would be terrible, and that's when it could become unpopular. That I think is when people would feel so desperate and potentially even quite ill, or really, really put out and not just put out in the sense that it's unpleasant, but put out in the sense that it's bad for them. It would be bad for them if they could not leave their house. It would be bad for them if, you know, the abused wife couldn't go for an hour-long walk, or if the teenage boy who hates his family couldn't get out, or if, you know, the nurse who's been working all week long can't go to the park and cycle around. It would be terrible for them, and I think that's when it could break down. So I think the government's actually got to be quite careful. Fine, if they want to bring in temporary regulations and rules and maybe even fines to ensure that especially infected people don't just wander the streets, that's fine. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But if they push too hard, I think people will start to push back, and that's when it could fall apart. So there has to be an element of trust, even if not every single person in the country is observing it.
Yeah. And I guess you've probably gotten backlash for your position.
Yes, huge amount of backlash.
Okay. So what do people say to you?
You don't care about old people. You don't care about vulnerable people. You want people to die. I mean, seriously, I get this all the time now. I think out of all the controversial issues I've talked about, this has probably proven to be one of the most difficult. You know, even I criticize climate change alarmism, for example, and I think Greens have become too extreme. That's a difficult issue to talk about. You'll be called a climate change denier, which I'm not. Or, as you know, I talk about transgenderism, in following in the footsteps of heroines like you, and that's a difficult issue to talk about. You will be demonized, you will be banned, and other things that you are fully aware of. But I think on this issue, I've had more pushback and more demonization than I have had on any other. And to such an extent, I've actually started to hold back from saying certain things, which I've never done before.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, I'm shocked as well. But there's a few times over the past 2 weeks where I've thought to myself, I want to write an article about something, and I just haven't done it. And it's really weird because all I'm really saying, I'm saying, look, we do need the lockdown in order to ease the burden on the NHS, because the NHS is ill prepared for pandemics, and that's just a fact. Especially a pandemic like this, which involves respiratory problems, that's going to make demands on the NHS that it's not able to meet at the moment. So we have to ease the burden. Fine, I completely accept that, and I've said I accept that many, many times. All I've said is we've got to be careful not to shut down economic life entirely. We've got to be careful to bear in mind the health consequences of taking people's jobs away, of taking people's wages away, of so 1 million more people in this country are now claiming universal credit. Universal credit is a fancy phrase for poverty assistance. It's what you claim when you are desperate. 1 million more people are now claiming it. That's a really serious situation. And when you live on that kind of money, it's not much money at all. Your health suffers, your mental health suffers, your physical health suffers, the health of your children can suffer. So we do have to keep thinking about all of that stuff. We do have to keep almost like a balance sheet to make sure that at the same time as we tackle this virus, which is essential, that we don't unwittingly create an economic catastrophe which would have huge impact on people's lives. I really hate the idea that this is a question of lives versus the economy. And, all the good people are on the side of saving lives, and then nasty people like me are on the side of saving the economy. Firstly, because that's not true. I think we should save lives. However old you are, I hate this idea that old people's lives are worth less than young people's lives.
Yeah, me
But
too.
the economy is lives too. The economy is work, it's production, it's consumption, it's the means through which we fund social services and health services and the building of houses and the creation of a society that keeps people well and productive. It's the economy. This is lives versus lives. It's not lives versus the economy. And I think the sooner we recognize that, then the more of a grown-up debate we can have about enforcing the lockdown, making sure that things get better as soon as possible, and then really quickly talking about easing the lockdown so that people can go back to work and the economy can go back to life.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that the lockdown is an attempt to protect the economy in some ways as well, because obviously, if things got way out of hand with the virus, that would have a negative impact on the economy also. Um, I wonder, why do you think that people are reacting like this to you? Why do you think that there is such a backlash? I mean, I'm surprised considering, because you do take controversial positions and you say what you think, and lots of people get mad at you.
Mm.
So I wonder
But
why this particular issue is so contentious.
I've been thinking about that. I think it's because there's a real sense of there's a warlike mentality. There's a kind of real Second World War mentality going on at the moment. The Queen really touched on that in her speech to the nation, which I actually was the first time I ever really liked the Queen's speech. So she did that speech to the nation, which is basically she was saying, "We'll pull through this. We will succeed. There will be better days." And then she used the Vera Lynn line, "We'll meet again," which was incredibly touching. The whole nation was basically in floods of tears. To say the phrase "we'll meet again" in this context, especially from her, as someone who obviously lived through the war, that really worked and that really connected with people. So there's a kind of Second World War mentality, in it together, the nation pulling together, do your bit. And I understand all of that, and it makes sense, and it is making it easier to deal with because there is a real sense of solidarity, and I think that's really important. But the upside, or the downside rather, of that is that it also gives rise to an instinct to demonize anyone who asks questions or anyone who says, "How long will this go on? When's it going to be over? When is freedom coming back?" I really hate the idea that anyone who raises those questions is whining about freedom because we should whine about freedom. We should talk about it all the time, and we should make sure that it's not something the government thinks it can take away this easily on a regular basis. So I think the pushback is largely because it's a serious health crisis. More than 5,000 people have died in the UK. That's a really high number. It's a nasty bug. Lots of people are getting it, and people are scared. People are worried. People are concerned about the future of their family's health and also their jobs. So there's a downbeat atmosphere and a desire to overcome that by engaging in this sense that this is a national struggle against some foreign enemy. That's all fine. I can live with all of that. But the problematic consequence is that anyone who says, "Hold on, let's think carefully about what we're doing," can be denounced as, fraternizing with the enemy, essentially. And that's what's happening to me and a few other people as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think your position is reasonable. I've had a big problem with the people who sort of take your position, not necessarily from you. I'm not blaming you for their response or whatever, but have taken your position, fear of losing civil liberties, fear of a police state, and they've attached it to the narrative that this is not a big deal. This is
Yeah.
a mild virus. It's just like a flu. The media is blowing it out of proportion. The government's lying about numbers, and this is all actually a big plot. Like, there's no real danger in this virus. So what? Some people die. People die anyway. No big deal. The real thing that's going on here is that, I don't know, the Illuminati or like the
Yeah.
powers that be or Bill Gates or whoever it is has invented this so that they can take control, so that they can microchip us, so that they can
Yeah.
impose a police state and all that stuff. And I find that stuff really dangerous. The
Yeah.
minimization of the seriousness of COVID, that pisses me off, and the idea that it's not real and it's invented, because it seems like more and more people are sort of picking up on that kind of conspiracy theory.
I hate that stuff so much. I really detest it. I think it's so immature and infantile and intellectually defunct, and it really is a problem for people like me because there's such an instinct to demonize critics at the moment that you can find yourself being lumped in with hysterical, deranged people, especially conspiracy theorists. No, I've seen a lot of that stuff. I've seen people say it's just like flu. It's not a big deal. It's fine. Old people die all the time. I mean, these are really deeply misanthropic arguments. You know, some of the older people, it is largely older people who are dying. Some of these people could have lived for another 10 years. That's a really serious problem if people are having that much of their life taken away. And then not to mention the families who are devastated by that. So all of this is I think it's an incredibly serious health crisis. It's the most serious health crisis of our generation, I would say. And it needs to be treated seriously. So I dislike those people with a passion. I am a lifelong critic of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are one of my least favorite things in the world, whether it's 9/11 conspiracies or the Obama birther conspiracy theories, or, you know, Prince Philip killed Princess Diana. I mean, there's all these theories swirling around. I think what happens, I'm interested to understand where conspiracy theories come from. And I think what happens is that when people feel that society is out of control or something strange has happened or something very bad has happened, they go looking for a source of blame. They go looking for the all-encompassing evil thing that we can pin this on. And that's happened during earlier pandemics. I mean, during the plague, the bubonic plague and the era of the Black Death, there were always searches for the person to blame. It was often the Jews. There were huge anti-Jewish pogroms during the Black Death because they were held responsible for this disease. Or women, you know, witches. There were lots of witch burnings during earlier plague epidemics because, you know, the strange woman at the end of the street who didn't quite adhere to all the right aspects of Christian faith would suddenly be demonized as the source of this disease. So that's always happened. I think we're seeing a similar dynamic now with these crazy people who are blaming 5G technology for the coronavirus problem, or I think even the blame on China. I'm quite suspicious of. I mean, I am incredibly critical of the Chinese regime and the Chinese Communist Party, and I think their failure to be honest about the pandemic in the beginning has caused a huge amount of problems. And it's actually a really important argument for freedom of speech, because the Chinese Communist Party effectively censored doctors who were saying, look, we've got this new virus and it's really pretty nasty, and they were preventing them from speaking out. So anyone who's in favor of censorship really needs to look at this situation and recognize that freedom of speech is always our friend and never our enemy. So the Chinese regime has a lot to answer for, but the current blaming on China, you know, these dirty people who eat strange foods and live in disgusting, diseased, crowded cities, I hear elements of racism in that, certainly China bashing. But I think what ties all these things together is this instinct in desperate, strange, peculiar times to find the thing that you can blame it all on, and then everything makes sense for you as an individual. It doesn't matter that the thing you're blaming it on is 5G or some other crazy thing that obviously bears no responsibility for this. It's just the desire to find something that will make you feel better and more in control of what's going on. So I understand the impulse behind conspiracy theories, but I think they are a wholly destructive force on contemporary debate, and people need to really stop it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, because I've been thinking about this a lot too, in light of all these conspiracy theories that I'm seeing spread around coronavirus, I think it is an attempt to control something that is not in our control. I mean, right now, we all feel totally out of control. We don't know how long this is going to go on for. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't stop it. So we invent something to blame it on so that we feel like we can understand and categorize and maybe have some sense of control. I wonder what you think about, I mean, I felt frustrated by the response of some leftists. I mean, leftists in general hate to criticize other cultures and other countries because that's xenophobic, apparently. And I wonder if you think that attitude played into first the government's reaction response. I wonder if you think that the government, just because I've read this in other places, if you think that the governments in the US, in the UK, in Canada were maybe slow to respond to shut down travel from China, from Wuhan, and whatnot, because they might be seen as racist or xenophobic or something.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point. And the thing I've struggled with in terms of the discussion about China over the past few weeks is this contradictory situation where, on the one hand, some people want to blame China for the whole thing. And there's now this discussion in the UK about suing China. Lots of people saying we should ostracize China, cast it out of the international community and all this other stuff, which is completely unfeasible and completely destructive and would harm everyone, not just Chinese people who I don't think deserve to be harmed. So there's that aspect of it. There's that desire to say China is the source of this problem and needs to pay for it for a long time, which I don't really like. But also, on the other side, there's this idea that criticizing China is racist. And I've seen a lot of that. I've seen people openly say that anyone who says that China should have done more in the beginning, or anyone who calls it the Wuhan flu, for example, which is what it was called for a while. I remember talking to my mother about the Wuhan flu months ago, and it was called that for a while. But anyone who says it now is racist and horrible and just wants to hate Chinese people. And, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talked about the people who were avoiding like Chinatown restaurants. She said that's just racism. And, that the left's desire to brand everything racist is not only is it irritating and normally wrong, but it also can be a barrier to open, reasoned discussion about problems. And one problem is the behavior of the Chinese regime, is the way in which it clamped down on discussion about this disease, and also is the way that our governments were slow to prevent travel from Wuhan in particular. Italy has suffered enormously from that problem because so many people, particularly from Wuhan, were flying into Italy for a long period of time, and now Italy has suffered enormously over the past couple of months from this disease. So the left's instinct to say, don't say this, shut up, it's xenophobic, just keep quiet, is actually a really destructive phenomenon and can lead to situations that are not only censorious, but which can actually damage public health and global relations and everything else. So I think so there's that dual process in relation to China at the moment. On the one hand, blame it for the whole thing, cast it out from the international community. And on the other hand, this bizarre leftist notion that it's racist to criticize foreign cultures. And I think both of those are problematic approaches at the moment.
Yeah, the leftists who refuse to criticize China baffle me, because China is like a major superpower and absolutely should be criticized. And that's not the same as criticizing Chinese individuals, Chinese people. Yeah. We're talking about the people in power, the government. And I guess, another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I was listening to your podcast with Peter Hitchens the other day, and you were talking about, I'm totally just changing the subject mid-sentence. Don't try to follow me. The perverse, you talked about the perverse glee, I think you called it, with which people were going along with this authoritarianism. And I think you were talking about this in a different context, but I've noticed this coming from leftists and like environmentalists, particularly like the burn it all down people, like the people who are sort of, who would probably fancy themselves anarchist or something like that, but are actually middle class, like fairly privileged people, and are like, yeah, burn it all down, start over, this is what we need, like a real revolution. Or the people who are the like, nature is sending us a message people. Like, this is all about, like, this is like It's like, I mean, it's the same as saying this is a message from God, except in this
Yeah,
case, it's nature.
yeah. It's the exact same. I've thought the same thing myself. It's like, whenever some, cranky evangelical Christian says that a flood or something is a message from God, we all laugh at them. But when an environmentalist says that this disease or bushfires in Australia or whatever else it might be is nature telling us off, everyone accepts that as an appropriate thing to say. It's really backward and quite medieval, I think. But I've seen a lot of that in relation to COVID-19. I've seen a lot of extreme Greens in particular relishing in the shutdown of society. Talking about how few airplane trails there are in the sky, and how cleaner cities are because there's no pollution, and how clean rivers have become, and dolphins have returned to Venice, and all this crap that people are coming out with no consideration at all for the fact that in northern Italy there may be dolphins swimming about, but there are, huge numbers of people locked in their houses and their families are under serious threat. And it's so anti-human, and it really has exposed, I think, the anti-human element to a lot of extreme green thinking in particular. But I think amongst the left more broadly, particularly the kind of, millennial socialists. So these are kind of, they're post-left socialists in a sense. They're not interested in class. They're not interested in economic questions. They're very identitarian. They're very woke, very politically correct. I think amongst those kind of millennial socialists, they've really welcomed, in the UK context in particular, they've really welcomed the lockdown. And in fact, they agitated for it quite openly, which is so surreal because these are the kind of people who were telling us for months and months that Boris Johnson was essentially a fascist, and that Brexit Britain would be the worst country since Nazi Germany, and this is now a far right nation. They were saying that for ages. And then suddenly they're cheering on Boris they're openly demanding, put us under house arrest, shut the country down, enforce authoritarianism, and lock us all in our houses for as long as you need to. And I thought to myself, listen, either you don't actually believe he was a fascist, in which case you were just misusing historical language, and that's a really shitty thing to do. Or you do think he's a fascist, and you are also fascist because you now want this fascist to shut down the entire nation. So the political confusions and the political contortionism of that section of the left, I thought was really interesting. But what it really brought home to me is that there is now this new left, which is usually quite painfully middle class, is obsessed with the kind of navel-gazing issues like identity and posturing and posing, and has no care or concern whatsoever for issues about working class life. They're all now at home working, making their podcasts, writing their columns, doing their public sector jobs or whatever else it is they do, having their food delivered to them by Deliveroo guys who are taking huge risks by going outside. And, being incredibly relaxed about the fact that millions of working people who can't work are now locked in their homes and reliant on the government for welfare handouts. And you think, is this really the country you want to live in? They have this almost wet dream of kind of welfare authoritarianism. It's like their perfect society. So I think actually the way in which the British left in particular has talked about this lockdown has actually exposed their kind of Stalinist tendencies and their disregard for freedom and their disregard for ordinary working people and their kind of self-satisfied, smug approach to the burning issues of the day.
Yeah, well, and also, like, I feel like they're just totally out of touch with what it's like to be poor or to be working class, because the burn it all down people make me really angry, because I'm like, if we destroy all this, if the economy is ruined, if there are no small businesses, if there are not jobs, if people are unemployed, this isn't going to be some great like working class revolution. This isn't going to help the people who are, living in poverty. Those are the people who are going to suffer the most and who are going to die. Like, this is not a revolution, and burning it all down and destroying everything and starting all over again would be a nightmare for working class and poor people. Only the most privileged people would survive that. And it's, to me, it just signals that they have no idea what it's like to be poor or working class and to be living paycheck to paycheck and to know that if their job stops, then their income stops basically immediately. They don't have a nest egg, they don't have a wealthy family, they don't have property, you know, like it makes me so angry.
Yeah, I completely and utterly agree with that. And the thing that I find so incredibly frustrating, the way I see it is that if you're enjoying the lockdown, now we all accept that it has to happen to a certain extent for a period of time, but if you're enjoying it or relishing in it, then you're probably a really privileged person. You probably live in a big house, you probably have a garden, you can carry on working. Well, bully for you, because there are huge, vast numbers of people who can't do that. So the privilege that has been unwittingly exposed by the leftist cheerleaders of the lockdown, I think, is really, really quite striking. But it touches on a broader point which you've raised there, which is their complete disconnection from any sense of working class life and working class politics. And I think that's really the story of the modern left. The story of the modern left is its drift away from class towards identitarianism, from the universalism of class politics, which was about people getting together despite their differences because they had a shared interest of fighting against the bosses and fighting for better work and better pay and better conditions, and move away from that universalist dynamic towards the sectionalism and divisiveness of identity politics, which is all about pitting one identity group against another and playing out, who is the most oppressed, who deserves the most state resources, who deserves the most pity, who deserves the most respect. So all of this points to a shift that's been taking place in the left over the past 3 or 4 decades, which is just a drift away from any sense of class politics and from working class communities. And we've now ended up with a left which not only doesn't understand working class communities, but actually often feels contempt for them and looks upon them as being insufficiently enlightened, as being sexist and racist. They all voted for Brexit because they're so stupid. They read tabloid newspapers, they watch stupid TV shows, they don't bring up their kids properly, they feed them bad food, they feed them junk food. They're probably transphobic because they don't want a boy in their daughter's changing room at school. I mean, it's just prejudice upon prejudice, and it's so often aimed at the kind of communities that the left usually, historically, wanted to represent, working class communities who are now seen as being unwoke. So we now have a situation where, and this is so pronounced in the UK, where the left is now an entirely middle class phenomenon. I mean, it's just astonishing. So many working class seats fell to the Conservatives at the election in December. I mean, it was just historically unprecedented. Vast numbers of seats that had been Labour for, in some cases, 80 or 90 years, in huge numbers, they all voted for Boris because the working classes finally, I've been waiting for this moment all my adult life, the working classes have finally turned against the left. Because the left turned against them. So I think we're witnessing a really historical upset in some of these issues. And what now passes for the left is, in fact, a kind of deeply middle class, very conceited, morally superior movement, which is obsessed with eccentric issues of identitarianism that most people are not concerned with. And it's just a very strange, divisive, censorious, shrill outfit. And I think it needs to just die off, is my personal view.
Yeah, I mean, the exact same thing, of course, happened in the US, where people who voted for Trump are just all written off as stupid and racist and misogynist and ignorant, or as, part of the conservative religious right.
Yeah.
And Democrats and their supporters completely ignored the fact that a lot of people voted for Trump just because they didn't want to vote for the Democrats. It wasn't because they liked Trump or thought that he was going to be a great president or supported all of his positions.
Yeah.
And it's just this it's totally classist, and it's, many, many, many of those who support the Democrats are very privileged, highly educated, middle class or upper class people, and they don't see that their version of progressivism or liberalism is the thing that they're claiming to criticize. You know, they're constantly
Yeah.
trying to criticize privilege,
Yeah.
and talk about, you know, oppression and marginalization and all of that. And they seem to have no concept of who it is that is actually marginalized and why, and what they're doing wrong in terms of their supposed support for marginalized people.
Absolutely, and that's completely true of the US. It's also true of the UK that the shift of the left towards being this kind of metropolitan, middle class, very well educated, very well connected machine, essentially, cut off from the rest of society, particularly people who actually, work for a living. And it's the same across Europe. If you look at the class makeup of left-wing parties in Europe, they are now all highly educated graduates from the middle classes. That's what the left is now. It's not working class people at all. And so I think that's a really striking phenomenon. The left has become a plaything of the middle class elite, whereas what the left originally was founded to do was to represent people who didn't have a voice in politics, i.e., the working classes. If you look in the UK, last year we celebrated the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo massacre, when working class men, women, and children marched in Manchester for the right to vote in 1819. And that was really, in many ways, the beginning of the left in the UK. It was working class people going out saying, we want to vote, we want a voice. And that was in 1819, and we didn't get universal suffrage for everyone until 1928, which is a salutary reminder of how long these things can take. So that's what the left was founded to do. And when I call myself left-wing and everyone laughs in my face, that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a politics that actually represents people who don't have much representation in public life. They don't have newspaper columns. They don't have a seat in the House of Lords. They don't have podcasts because they're too busy having useful, productive jobs and raising families. So they need a form of representation, and that can take the form of the right to vote, and their vote should be taken seriously rather than being demeaned as racist and stupid. The right to strike, I think the right to strike is incredibly important, and the right to organize themselves in an independent way in order to make an impact on the world and improve their lives. And that's what the left used to be interested in, and that's why I became a left-winger, because I was interested in it too. Then, suddenly, through no fault of mine and no fault of yours and no fault of some of us who I think are still on the right side, the left just became something else entirely. It gave up on all of those issues. So I didn't come up with this phrase, someone else did, but I always feel that I didn't leave the left left me. And that's very much how I feel about the left. And, we have in the UK, it's so pronounced at the moment. If you look at the Corbynista movement, so this is the movement around Jeremy Corbyn, who's no longer Labour leader, thank God, but there was this kind of youthful, highly middle class movement around Jeremy Corbyn, very white, very wealthy, very well educated, over-educated, as I like to call them, too much education and not enough sense. It was a very privileged movement. And I think one of the roles identity politics plays, and I think this is a really key role of identity politics, is that it allows privileged people to pose as being oppressed. I think that's actually one of the key dynamics behind it, because what it means is that, you can have these incredibly well-connected, wealthy trans people, or, a black woman who runs a company, or whatever else it might be. Or, in the UK, we have some newspaper columnists who come from incredibly privileged backgrounds, private education, Oxford University, straight into cushy jobs in the media. But they claim to be oppressed because they come from a certain minority group. So what identity politics does, it allows the middle classes to present themselves as victims of oppression. And it gives them the glamour of oppression, the glamour of being put upon. And it's so completely phony. But I think that's one of the reasons they cling on to identity politics so strongly, because it's a way of disguising their privilege and disguising the incredibly haughty, arrogant, authoritarian role they play in contemporary politics.
Totally. And so, I mean, do you think that this crisis, this pandemic, is going to have an impact on politics and political discourse. And, you know, these things that you're talking about, like this overwhelming focus on identity politics over class and over real issues.
You know, I flit from day to day on that question. So one day I think to myself, this is the end of identity politics, because who's now going to obsess over, you know, what toilet a trans person can use, or microaggressions, or cultural appropriation, or, you know, white people eating sushi? Who's going to talk about all that crap now that we have a really serious health crisis which needs us to focus and to stick together and to have social solidarity? Because social solidarity, of course, is the great enemy of identity politics, because identity politics is, in my view, identity politics is really just the militant wing of neoliberalism. It's a very individuated, self-obsessed, consumerist ideology, which is all about picking and choosing your identity and obsessing over yourself at the expense of everyone else. So identity politics I see as an incredibly individualist, destructively individualist and narcissistic movement, whereas social solidarity is to a certain extent about self-negation, working with others, recognizing shared interests, sacrificing things to help your neighbor and all that stuff. So we're seeing social solidarity now in the UK and other countries. We're seeing communities pull together, and identity politics has disappeared from the front pages. People just aren't talking about it. So some days I'm quite hopeful that this will be a huge body blow to identity politics, but then other days I just think it's such a strong ideology, and in many ways it had become the organizing principle of Western public life, not simply in the kind of noisy Twitter sphere, but in the education system, in universities, in the political class, and especially among millennials who will at some point run the country. It's a very strong ideology. So I think it could well survive this process. So I think that aspect of the discussion is up for grabs. But as to whether the pandemic will change politics, I think I see a lot of people now saying this is going to represent a shift from the era of capitalism towards a new form of state socialism, because so many governments are now pumping huge amounts of money into the economy and into infrastructure. You know, maybe not. The point I would make is that it depends on what people do. It depends on the discussions. You know, a disease on its own can't change society. It depends what we do in response to it. I always give the example of the Black Death. The Black Death came to England in 1348 and killed around 40% of the population. But it wasn't the Black Death which transformed society for the better. It was the Peasants' Revolt. So the Peasants' Revolt came a few decades after the Black Death, and it was peasants, literally peasants, rising up against the incredibly strict economic policies that had been brought in by the authorities in response to the Black Death. So it's just a good example of how, you know, a disease can't change society for good or ill. It depends very much on how we choose to respond to it, how we choose to understand it, and what policies we choose to implement in response to it too. I think this is where the old left could have played a really positive role in terms of talking about social needs, social solidarity, the economic needs of working families, the need to rebuild infrastructure, all those things. But the problem with the left having exhausted itself and turned itself into this ridiculous, eccentric, racially obsessed identitarian movement is that it's robbed itself of the ability to make those arguments. So I think we do have to rediscover ways to say that in the wake of this pandemic, we need a really serious focus on improving the social standing and the living standards of working people. And I think that has to be one of the key aims that coming out of this pandemic. We need to improve wages and conditions because they have been utterly exposed as being insufficient in this pandemic.
Yeah, totally. I'm sorry. I was sick recently, not with COVID, so I still have a bit of a cough. I'm glad that we got a chance to talk because I had been following your commentary around all this, and I sort of thought we were going to argue more, but you know, it's funny when people actually have conversations, they find that they agree more than they disagree, eh?
Absolutely. That always happens. I think that's why it's good to talk. Always good to talk.
Yeah, of course. Yes, thank you so much. It was so great to talk with you. And obviously, we should do it again. There's like a million other things. I'd love to talk to you sometime more about the climate change stuff.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can set something up around that too. But I hope that you're doing good and that you survive the lockdown, and maybe we'll
Fingers
get a chance to see each other once again once we're allowed back on planes.
crossed. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll talk
Thank
to
you
you
so
soon.
much.
Yeah, yeah.
Cheers.
Take care. Bye bye.